One of rap's most untouchable kingpins is suddenly at the center of a financial storm, and the internet is questioning everything it thought it knew about his empire. $70 million. That's the number circulating right now whenever people bring up Rick Ross and the assets tied to his name. Before we get into what's real and what's rumor, understand this. When a man who built his entire identity around owning things, flossing things, and embodying boss culture starts getting mentioned in the same breath as financial trouble, that's a story that demands attention. Whether the numbers add up or not, the narrative is already spreading, and we're about to break down every layer of it. What's good, fam? Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel goes deeper than the headlines, deeper than the tweets, deeper than the gossip. We connect the dots everybody else skips over. And today we're doing exactly that with one of hip-hop's biggest personalities and one of its most carefully constructed images, Rick Ross, the boss. The man who turned excess into a brand and luxury into a lifestyle that rappers spent a decade trying to copy. But right now, people online aren't talking about his fleet or his estate. They're talking about whether that empire is starting to crack. And the question splitting the internet right now is simple. Is Rick Ross actually going broke? Or are people completely misreading how celebrity wealth works? Stay with me until the end, because by the time we're done, you'll see this story in a way nobody else is telling it. Let's start at the beginning, because you can't understand where Rick Ross is right now without understanding how high he built himself up. This isn't a story about an artist who stumbled into success and got lucky with a single. This is a man who engineered one of the most deliberate and calculated images in the history of hip-hop. William Leonard Roberts too grew up in Carroll City, Florida, a neighborhood that didn't exactly hand people private jets and mansion keys. What he did was study the culture, study what power looked like, and build a persona so convincing and so fully committed that the industry had no choice but to take it seriously. When Hustlin' dropped in 2006, it wasn't just a song. It was a declaration of intent. The production felt like money. The voice felt like authority. And the image that came with it, the size, the beard, the stacks of cash, jewelry that looked like it weighed as much as a small child. All of it worked together to create something hip-hop hadn't quite seen in that specific way before. Rick Ross wasn't just rapping about being rich. He was performing richness as a daily reality. Every appearance, every verse, every interview was another brick in the wall of an empire that felt too large to fail. Then came the deals, the partnerships, the expansion. Maybach Music Group became a label that signed artists who built their own careers under his umbrella. Wingstop became one of his most talked about business moves, with reports of him owning dozens of franchise locations, turning into a recurring conversation about his business mind outside of music. The car collection became legendary. Rolls-Royces, Lamborghinis, Maybachs, all sitting in driveways across properties spread throughout the South. His estate in Fayetteville, Georgia, known as Promised Land, became something people genuinely drove out to look at from outside the gate. Over 100 rooms, multiple pools, a property so large it became a landmark in conversations about rapper real estate. He wore chains that cost more than most people make in 5 years. He performed on stages wearing jewelry insured in its own right. He posted from private jets so consistently that fans simply assumed that was his standard mode of transportation. And for a long time, there was no reason to question any of it, because the music was selling, the tours were happening, and the collaborations kept coming from some of the biggest names in the game. This was Rick Ross at his absolute peak. The visual alone communicated a financial reality most people accepted without ever asking for receipts. But here's where it gets interesting, because the same internet that built up the boss narrative is the same internet that started poking holes in it. And it didn't start with a dramatic legal filing or some financial journalist's expose. It started the way most things start in the social media era, with something small. Something that, in isolation, would mean nothing, but in the context of everything else people thought they knew, suddenly felt like a clue. Rick Ross was spotted flying commercial, economy class, to be exact, and the internet immediately turned it into a headline. Now pause for a second, because this matters. Flying commercial doesn't mean you're broke. Plenty of wealthy people fly commercial for 100 different reasons: convenience, scheduling, or simply the fact that chartering a private jet for every single trip is more expensive than most people realize. But for someone whose entire brand was built on the visual of excess, on the promise that he never had to compromise on comfort, the image of Rick Ross in a standard airline seat hit different. It wasn't about the logic of it. It was about the brand of it. And when your brand is your most valuable asset, anything that contradicts the visual becomes a problem. The comments under those posts were brutal, not because people were genuinely worried about his finances, but because the internet smelled blood in the water. Jokes flooded in, memes got made, and people who'd already been quietly wondering about his finances suddenly felt permission to say it out loud. The question shifted from, is Rick Ross still making great music, to is Rick Ross still actually living the life he's been selling us for 20 years? And once that question was out there, people started going back through the timeline. They looked at the gaps between major projects, compared how his name was showing up in cultural conversation now versus 5 or 10 years ago, and started digging into old headlines that had never quite gone away. Headlines about taxes, legal disputes, and financial obligations suggesting the luxury lifestyle wasn't just expensive, it was extraordinarily expensive to maintain. Let's talk about the tax situation, because this is where things get specific. Over the years, reports emerged about Rick Ross facing serious tax liens from the IRS. A tax lien isn't the same as being broke. It's not even necessarily the same as being in financial crisis. But it is the government officially saying you owe money and that it's taking steps to collect. And when those figures get reported publicly, in the millions, it gives people enough ammunition to start painting a picture. That narrative has surfaced more than once over the years, and every time it resurfaces, it gets folded into the broader story people are building about whether his empire is as solid as it looks from the outside. Here's the thing about maintaining a luxury lifestyle at scale that most outside observers underestimate. The costs aren't just big, they're relentless. A property the size of Promised Land doesn't take care of itself. You need staff. You need maintenance. You need utilities running on a property that most small office buildings would struggle to heat and cool. You need insurance for the cars, the jewelry, the property itself. You need security. And all of that is before factoring in the lifestyle content fans expect to see regularly. Because the moment the posts stop showing the jets and the cars and the watches, people notice. The absence of flex becomes its own story. That's the trap ultra-luxury celebrity branding creates. And Rick Ross walked into it with his eyes open, because the brand was always the point. It was always what separated him from talented rappers who weren't building a persona meant to transcend any single song or album. But when your brand depends entirely on appearing to have unlimited resources, any crack in that image, no matter how small, becomes a story. And when those cracks stack up, the internet starts connecting dots, whether those dots belong together or not. Now let's get into the asset seizure conversation, because this is where the $70 million figure comes from, and where things require the most careful reading. The claim that $70 million in assets has been seized is the kind of headline that spreads instantly and gets reshared without much context attached. The reality is that asset seizure, in a legal and financial sense, can mean a lot of different things. It can mean a court placed a hold on certain assets pending a legal dispute. It can mean tax authorities moved against property to collect unpaid obligations. It can mean a judgment was entered in a lawsuit and the winning party is trying to collect. What it doesn't automatically mean is that someone is wiped out, destitute, or financially destroyed. But here's the real kicker. Even if the technical explanation is far more nuanced than the headline suggests, the headline is already out there. And in celebrity culture, perception moves faster than facts. Once the image of Rick Ross having assets seized gets attached to the image of him flying economy, which gets attached to the absence of a current #1 record, people stop waiting for the full picture. They start finishing the story themselves. And the story they finish sounds like the beginning of a fall from grace for one of hip-hop's most symbolic success stories. Now let's address the 50 Cent element. Because you can't have a Rick Ross financial controversy story without bringing in the man who's made it his personal mission to be Ross's most persistent critic. 50 Cent and Rick Ross have one of the longest-running and most entertaining feuds in hip-hop history, and it's never really been purely about music. It's always been about image, credibility, and narrative control. 50 Cent, himself one of the most sophisticated practitioners of social media trolling in the culture, understood early that the fastest way to damage Rick Ross wasn't just releasing a diss track, it was attacking the foundation the Rick Ross brand was built on. He's consistently posted content mocking Ross's weight, his finances, his lifestyle, his decisions. A lot of it is clearly comedic trolling, but the cumulative effect of years of that content is that it's kept certain questions about Rick Ross alive in public conversation, even when there was nothing new to report. Every time a Rick Ross financial story emerges, 50 Cent is there with a comment, a meme, or a post that amplifies it and directs his massive following toward it. Whether that's fair is a separate question, but in terms of shaping public perception, it's been undeniably effective. And the thing about 50 Cent's trolling strategy is that it isn't random. He specifically targets things that are hard to disprove without looking defensive. You can't prove you're rich by posting more pictures of your lifestyle, because he'll just repost them with a caption that makes it look desperate. You can't ignore it, because silence looks like confirmation. And you can't engage with it directly without elevating the story further. It's a trap that's genuinely hard to escape once you're inside it. And Rick Ross has been inside it for years. Meaning even during periods when his finances were perfectly fine, public perception was being shaped by someone with both the platform and the motivation to make people question it. This brings us to a broader conversation about how celebrity wealth actually works and why fans consistently misread it. When people see a rapper with a Maybach and a mansion, they assume he owns those things outright with unlimited cash on top. What they don't see are the financing arrangements, the business partnerships, the label advances that have to be recouped, management percentages, touring costs, production budgets, legal fees, and the extraordinary ongoing expense of maintaining a public image at that level. Celebrity wealth is almost never what it looks like from the outside, and it's almost never as simple as someone having $100 million sitting in a bank account they dip into whenever they feel like buying another car. Net worth, the figure that gets thrown around in articles and fan debates, is total assets minus total liabilities. It includes the value of properties, business equity, catalog ownership, and other holdings. What it doesn't represent is liquid cash freely available to spend. A rapper with a $50 million net worth might have $40 million tied up in real estate that hasn't sold, $5 million in business equity that can't be easily converted, and tax obligations eating through whatever remains. That doesn't mean he's broke. But it also means he's not sitting on a pile of cash that makes every expense effortless. Rick Ross built his wealth in ways particularly susceptible to this misunderstanding. His Wingstop franchises have value, but that value is tied up in the operation of physical businesses with real costs, real staff, real overhead. His real estate holdings are significant, but real estate requires constant maintenance and can't always convert to cash on demand, especially in unfavorable market conditions. His music catalog has value, but how that value translates into monthly income depends on streaming performance, licensing activity, and market demand. None of this means he's struggling, but it means the picture is far more complicated than either his most committed fans or his loudest critics want to admit. Let's talk about the music side, because it matters for understanding where Rick Ross stands today compared to his peak. The early part of his career was defined by culturally dominant albums, Port of Miami, Trilla, Deeper Than Rap, Teflon Don. All of these arrived during a period when Rick Ross sat at the center of hip-hop conversation. He was the artist everyone wanted featured on their records, the voice behind the biggest DJ Khaled anthems, the rapper whose verses you could feel through the floor at any club worth being in. That dominance translated into significant income from record sales, touring, and the kind of cultural relevance that makes every business opportunity easier to access. But the music industry changed dramatically while Ross kept making records. Streaming flattened the revenue that physical and digital sales used to generate. The playlist culture that drives discovery today doesn't naturally favor the maximalist luxury rap he built his career on. The cultural moment shifted toward different sounds, different energies, different personalities. Ross kept releasing projects his core fans appreciated, but the commercial footprint stopped matching what it was in 2010 or 2012. That's not a failure. It's a natural evolution most artists with long careers go through. But it does mean the income side of the equation looks different than it used to. The touring income deserves its own discussion too. At his peak, Rick Ross headlined shows generating serious money, major festival spots, international tours, domestic runs alongside other A-list artists. But the math of touring at that level involves private travel, hotel accommodations, tour staff, security, production writers, and promotional costs that eat significantly into the take. And as headlining opportunities shift with cultural relevance, that revenue can fluctuate considerably year to year. His brand partnerships and endorsement deals have kept him relevant on the business side, and this is likely where some of his most durable income comes from today. The Wingstop story is well documented and generally positive, though exactly how many locations he currently owns and how profitable they are isn't reported in real time. He's done deals with spirits brands, clothing partnerships, and other ventures, keeping his name attached to commerce even when the charts aren't reflecting his presence the way they once did. But again, the profitability of those arrangements isn't public information, and what looks like a thriving empire from the outside might be running on tighter margins than the imagery suggests. What's undeniably true is that Rick Ross has been more visible in the business conversation than the chart conversation in recent years, a transition many artists make deliberately, choosing sustainable long-term businesses over chasing algorithm-driven streaming numbers. The question is whether that transition is happening on his terms, by strategic choice, or whether it's being shaped by financial realities he has less control over. That's a question nobody from the outside can definitively answer, which is exactly why the internet fills the vacuum with speculation. Now let's zoom out and think about what this story really represents beyond Rick Ross as an individual, because there's a much bigger conversation here about wealth, image, and sustainability in hip-hop culture. The genre has always had a complicated relationship with the truth of its own economics. The same genre that did more than any other to normalize and celebrate extreme wealth for Black artists and fans is also one where the pressure to appear wealthy can sometimes exceed the actual wealth itself. That creates a culture where even successful, genuinely wealthy artists can find themselves trapped by an image demanding more than their actual financial position can comfortably support. Rick Ross didn't invent that dynamic, but he's one of its most extreme examples, because he went further than almost anyone in constructing a wealth identity that left no room for any narrative other than total dominance. Every bar, every video, every interview, every post reinforced the same story. I'm the boss. I have more than you. I own everything I stand on. And when you tell that story at maximum volume for 2 decades, any evidence that contradicts it, even partial, even misread, becomes enormously newsworthy. The irony is that the very success of his brand is what makes the financial scrutiny so intense. Nobody writes detailed breakdowns of the finances of rappers who never claim to be that wealthy. But Rick Ross made the claim so publicly, so repetitively, and so convincingly that the standard he set for himself is essentially impossible to quietly step back from. He needs to either maintain the image in full or face a narrative that something has changed. And in a social media environment where anyone with a phone can become a financial analyst with 50,000 followers, the scrutiny never sleeps. Let's also be direct about something that sometimes gets lost in these conversations. Rick Ross isn't some fragile artist who built on nothing and got lucky. The man has survived things that would have ended most careers. He survived the correctional officer controversy that could have been career-ending in a genre where authenticity is currency. He survived years of the 50 Cent feud and came out the other side still making music his fan base responded to. He survived genuinely serious health scares. He survived business setbacks and kept building. Whatever the current state of his finances, and we should be honest that we don't have the full picture, the track record of his resilience is significant. But resilience doesn't make you immune to perception. And right now, perception is running hard in a direction his team is either choosing not to address or hasn't found the right way to address. Every day that passes without a clear counter-narrative from Ross or people close to him is another day the internet gets to write the story without him. And the story the internet is writing right now is one of financial pressure, lifestyle contradiction, and the beginning of an unraveling for an empire that spent 20 years being presented as untouchable. Here's what we know for certain. Rick Ross built something real. The label was real. The real estate was real. The business ventures were real. The cultural influence was absolutely real. Whether every individual financial claim made about him over the years was accurate is a separate matter, but the foundation of what he built isn't fiction. What's also real is that maintaining an empire at this scale requires constant income, constant management, and constant attention to the financial machinery underneath all that luxury imagery. And the world Rick Ross built his empire in doesn't look the same as the world of 2024 and beyond. The music industry generates money differently now. The culture moves differently. The platforms that build and destroy reputations operate at a speed nobody could have imagined when Hustlin' was in heavy rotation on BET. In that environment, even genuinely successful people can find the story told about them online diverging sharply from the reality they're actually living. And when you've spent as long as Rick Ross has carefully constructing a specific public reality, the gap between the story and the facts becomes deeply personal. So what does all of this actually mean for where Rick Ross stands today? The honest answer is that we don't know with certainty. The $70 million asset seizure figure circulating online requires careful sourcing and context before anyone accepts it at face value. The flying economy story is real, but it's far from definitive evidence of financial collapse. The tax and legal headlines have been part of his public story for years and haven't destroyed him yet. The business ventures continue to exist even if their current profitability is unknown. And the music career, while not at its commercial peak, continues to produce content that keeps him present in the culture. What's genuinely clear is that the narrative around Rick Ross and money has shifted in a direction that's not favorable to the image he built his entire career on. And in the celebrity economy, where image is literally a financial asset, a damaged narrative is a real problem regardless of what the balance sheet actually says. Whether Rick Ross is truly going broke, or whether this is just the internet doing what the internet does, taking fragments and building them into a story that feels satisfying even if it isn't entirely accurate, isn't a question that can be answered today with absolute certainty. What can be said is this: for a man who made luxury his identity and ownership his religion, even the conversation about financial pressure is a kind of earthquake. Because his entire power was built on the premise that this conversation would never happen, that the boss doesn't run out of anything, that the empire doesn't develop cracks, that the jets never get traded for economy seats. And now the conversation isn't just happening. It's the main event. It's pulling in views, pulling in clicks, and pulling in the kind of attention that forces even casual observers to look twice at a story they thought they already understood. Whether this turns out to be the beginning of a genuine unraveling, a temporary storm he weathers the way he's weathered every other challenge in his career, or simply a case of the internet building a narrative around incomplete information, the lesson here is bigger than Rick Ross himself. It's about what happens when image becomes inseparable from identity, when the brand is the man and the man is the brand. When the performance of wealth becomes so total and so sustained that any deviation from it reads as collapse rather than reality. That's the trap Rick Ross walked into willingly and brilliantly, and now finds himself having to navigate in the most public and unforgiving media environment that's ever existed. The culture will be watching. The internet will keep connecting dots whether they belong together or not. And Rick Ross, who has never been the kind of man to quietly accept a narrative written about him without fighting back, will eventually have something to say about all of it. When he does, that response will tell us more about where things actually stand than any leaked document or viral post ever could. Until then, the story stays open, and open stories on the internet only go in one direction. What are your thoughts on all of this? Do you think Rick Ross is actually facing serious financial pressure? Or is this another case of the internet building a mountain out of a rumor? Drop your take in the comments below, and if you want more breakdowns like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because we're just getting started.